There's too many PhDs out there. I mean, it's fine. You want to stay in university, do a PhD. It's harmless, but I honestly think all the stats will bear me out here that it's pretty useless. It drops your employability a bit. So we don't have that problem at LIS, but I think that even in more mainstream universities, there should be more help to help students connect what they're doing with what the vast majority of them will do later rather than do a PhD.
Hello and welcome to the Future of Universities podcast series. My name is Madeline Arkins, Project Officer at UIN and your host for today. Today we are joined by Carl Gombrich, Co-founder, Dean and Academic Lead at the London Interdisciplinary School, to discuss their innovative approach to education that blends interdisciplinary learning with real-world problem-solving and critical engagement with AI. Stay tuned and explore the concept of interactional expertise in the digital age, the importance of media literacy, and the challenge of breaking out of the cycle of academia reproducing itself.
I'm very glad to have the pleasure of speaking with Carl Gombrich on this very topic. Carl is co-founder, dean and academic lead of the London Interdisciplinary School with a background spanning mathematics, physics, philosophy and professional opera performance. Previously, as a teaching fellow at University College London, he spearheaded the development and launch of the UK's first Bachelor's in Arts and Sciences degree. His expertise has earned him a place in the British Academy Working Group on Interdisciplinarity, and he's also a core panel member at the Accreditation Organisation of the Netherlands and Flanders. Carl, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Madeline. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Very nice to be here.
Great. So let's get into it, Carl. You had quite a diverse career path from mathematics and physics to philosophy and opera singing. And I'm interested, as I'm sure everyone else is, in how this very eclectic background maybe influenced your views on education and indeed how your background led you to your current role at the London Interdisciplinary School.
Yeah, thanks, Madeline. So I'm getting on a little bit now. So this story can take a long time. So and because I'm an opera singer, I have a bass voice, so sometimes people snooze off like it's granddad talking. So if I say too much, just intervene. But basically, it was quite interesting because I was doing all these different things all my life and struggled to fit in any one place or another. But when I then got to UCL, the great university in London, and had worked on their foundation courses, I became kind of known as a guy who had all these different skill sets and knowledge sets. And then when they wanted to set up the first Bachelor of Arts and Sciences in the UK, I was a weirdly natural go-to, or I wasn't in the academic mainstream. And it was wonderful for me because suddenly all these parts of my life that had been rather disparate and not joined together came together. And it was also just around the time, around 2010, when people were seeing the impact of Web 2.0. There's a lot of talk about future skills and the future of work and what graduates were going to need. And I wasn't young then, I was in my early 40s, but I felt like I was on the crest of quite a young wave, and I was a bit older, so I experienced that shift, and so I was able to lead in it. And so that kind of made my career. I had a wonderful time at UCL setting up the degree for 8.5 years in a design, setup, launch, and establishing that program, and learned so much about interdisciplinary education, about what really can work, what gives fantastic graduate outcomes, what the challenges are in major established institution, the benefits, the pitfalls, the sorts of students it can attract. So that was a great experience for me, and all those disparate parts of my life, my learning came together in that productive way.
That's it's rare that there is a role or a career that is such a nice marriage of everything else you've done before. So happy to hear that. For the uninitiated, because the London Interdisciplinary School began in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, what is the school's ethos, its MO? How does it maybe walk the walk in terms of helping create such well-rounded graduates?
Our curriculum is as simple as it is radical. We don't have any departments. We just teach through real-world problems and methods to tackle those problems. So it really is simple, but it's so different to the thinking that you have to learn subject by subject or discipline by discipline to get what people might call rigor or relevance. It's so different that people sometimes struggle to understand what we do. And I guess that's okay. We want to be different. That's the point of being the first university since Warwick, really, in the UK, 40 plus years ago, to get our own degree awarding powers at our inception. We want to be different, but we constantly have to kind of explain this and tell the story. So these real world problems are things like inequality, sustainability, climate change, AI and ethics, and so on. And then around, that's like the jam and the sandwich, if you like. And the bread on either side are these methods. And that's where students get a lot of rigor and a lot of discipline. They have to learn data science, quantitative modeling, how to make a great video, ethnography techniques, survey design, focus group, design and running, all those things that go through 3 years. And we think we've now got a great range of those kinds of methods. You might call them skills or research methods, doesn't really matter, depends which audience you're talking to really, but a range of things they can actually do, which then allow them to tackle many of the great complex.
I think we lost you, Carl, just at the end there.
Sorry, I'm not, where did you lose me?
You were talking about having the research methods as a foundation to then tackle these problems in those areas.
Yes, that's right. So we got our graduates' first graduating ceremony this Friday, and it's fantastic to see the capstones that these students have produced and so on. I think where the challenge for us is that very notion of roundedness is a difficult thing for an 18-year-old to see themselves in, because we have this legacy of thinking I'm either going to be a biochemist, or I'm going to be an economist, or I'm going to be someone who does English literature, which is so far divorced from the reality of most working lives now, post 23-year-old. When you say you'll have a whole bunch of tools which will enable you to tackle many, in fact, the majority of the real world problems you'll meet in the workplace, that's still a jump for a young student to see themselves in that kind of image. So that's been our challenge, selling, if you like, what we do. And we're still wrestling with whether we can really say, look, this is about a kind of a very wide set of skills which you'll use to focus on various different problems, or whether we now need to think a little bit more like clusters and concentration. So should we say, you'll focus mostly on poverty and inequality, or mostly on migration and geopolitics. I want to resist that because I know the data out there, and I know that once you go down that route, you box yourself in a bit, and also all the jobs you're going to do don't really care whether you start poverty. The job you're doing now, you could have done any number of degrees to do what you're doing, do it really well, and that applies to whether you're a product manager, a program manager, a business analyst, all the things that actual graduates do. It doesn't really matter what particular discipline they study at university. So I'd rather keep it rounded, to use that word, and rigorous but general. But there is a perception challenge there that students find it difficult to imagine where this is going to lead after the program.
Yeah, I think so many things, that kind of cultural mind shift is among the hardest to tackle. You can put all the structures in there, but if people still perceive you, and I'm biased in my own way because I have an English literature background and then pivoted to sociology. But yeah, that people perceive you as almost like a jack of all trades, master of none, rather than this kind of rounded individual who is adaptable to so many different roles. And as you say, in a way that the job market doesn't predestine you into one direction from the get-go.
Yeah, there's a whole literature now out there about this, about the return of generalism, the return of polymathy. And I'm very convinced by a lot of that literature that this is an age. And when we get onto AI, maybe we'll discuss AI again today, what that's doing for what education needs to do. And that people seem to be terrified by that concept. I don't know why, but they really struggle with this as a possible turn of the wheel. I mean, we've had polymathy before in the Renaissance. That's why we have the term Renaissance man or person now. That was normal. So why do we think it's impossible to be that way? It's clearly not impossible. And of course, we had the great Arab flourishing in the 10th century, not in the 11th century in Baghdad. And so there are many periods in history where, for whatever reason, there's a kind of an upsurge in communications, for example, or an upsurge in the sort of novelty of what's going on in the environment where you need these kind of polymathic and generalist skills. But we haven't been that way from the Industrial Revolution right through the 20th century. And so people find it very difficult to conceive that we could be entering a new space where that is, in fact, needed and the norm. But there are all sorts of writers out there. There are big shot entrepreneurs saying this. There are people documenting their own careers. So many of us have now had diverse and multiple careers. And the education doesn't really reflect that, at least not in the Anglosphere. It's very stuck in the late 19th, early 20th century way of thinking about education.
Yeah. I'm inclined to agree with you. Maybe also going back to what you said about the digital age, AI, how that is changing the landscape continually. The challenges that you've encountered in implementing something like this, maybe not even necessarily related to your work at LIS, but also in the building of that bachelor's in arts and sciences. What kind of challenges do you come across when you're trying to implement this kind of change in higher education?
So there are two very different challenges, really. One is trying this very new thing in a very old established institution, where the challenge was more the kind of bureaucratic structure and getting people from one department to teach on our degree, having our students go to all the different faculties at UCL. That was very formal, the challenge, but the intellectual challenge wasn't too difficult at UCL in some ways. There was enough buy-in from some really big hitters, big academics to make it work. When you start a new university, there are lots of other different sorts of challenges. There's the whole concept of being a new university. Why would you go to one? And then there are these challenges, I say, about designing a completely new curriculum and how that's perceived, how you convince people it's going to be rigorous. But you don't, I haven't had the problem with academics here because we've recruited the faculty, right? So these are people who want something different. They're all very interdisciplinary in their background. They enjoy the kind of generative creativeness that gives to the whole place. So they typically have multiple disciplinary backgrounds faculty here. They will start in the humanities, maybe like English, like you, maybe like you, they do a master's in social science and then a PhD in something pretty hardcore quantitative with some data collection and analysis, or they go exactly the other way around. So that's been really fun and really not a problem. But the problems here are what it means to establish a university that gets on the map people want to be part of. Madeline, I don't know how this works live, and it's never happened to me, but my battery is running low.
Oh,
Can your listeners hold on a second while I grab my cable and
They
plug
can, of
myself in?
course.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll tell them a joke in the meantime.
Yeah. Do you know in
Okay.
Dutch? Do you know any Dutch jokes? I don't know. In fun.
Oof, okay, really. I don't know how much of our audience is Dutch, but regardless, I'm not going to tell you a joke in Dutch. I will take this opportunity, however, to ask if anyone has any questions they would like to send Carl. Please use the Q&A and chat function now. And in about, say, 10 minutes, I'll open up the lines for talking again. And here's the moment where I say, and they loved my joke. They loved my Dutch jokes. So
What was your joke?
Oh,
I love telling jokes. We have a British comedian called Tommy Cooper. Some of your listeners may even know him, who's just a wonderful, deadpan, strange, surrealist humor.
Okay,
So...
well, now that I know that this can happen live, I'll make sure next time to have a Dutch joke prepared.
Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. All good. So challenges. So in essence, it seems like it's mostly bureaucratic and not intellectual, which is good. Maybe looking on the flip side, what sort of opportunities do you see emerging from this approach that the traditional model overlooks?
I think, like any kind of revolution, or let's say evolution in education, that the timelines are very long, and that it's really tough in our modern age where people think if you create something, it has to make an impact within 6 months. I've been interested in the literature coming out from the US on the impact of liberal arts. There's a very good book published quite recently, maybe 2 years ago, called Liberal Arts, the Evidence It Needs. And they finally got a major corpus of longitudinal studies about people who've been through the liberal arts system. And this builds on some other work, just serious work, which is done about the number of Nobel Prize winners emerging from the liberal arts and so on. I'd love to do that in this country because I know from UCL, the several hundred students we graduated from there by the time I left, that those guys are simply smashing it. They are doing such amazing things. CEOs of extremely exciting startups, starting their own charities. Of course, they're big shots in the corporate world as well. You'd expect that. And I think the same thing's going to happen to our students. So we have a slightly different cohort. We are very liberal in the range of students we take. We like to take some students who struggled at school or may not have as good grades, and we think are still very exciting. Some of those students do extremely well with us. But I do think that the sort of impact of this type of education, where you're exposed to many different perspectives, you have to learn a range of tools. So you're not just a geeky coder, you're not just an arty video maker. I do think those have very long-term benefits. The challenge is tracking that and having the evidence that's the case.
This was going to be my next question, because obviously you've just had your first cohort of graduates. How are you measuring success in interdisciplinarity, or what kind of metrics or processes do you use to evaluate the efficacy of what you're doing as an institution?
So the honest answer is we have simple metrics in terms of kind of student satisfaction and employment. The honest answer, but one that I can't answer very positively, is I'd love to have a whole framework of researchers set up to test things like competencies and so on, but we're tiny. We just don't have that budget and those kinds of personnel. I think this is worth saying. The multiples you get in the US for starting something like this are 10x what you can raise in Europe or the UK. So we started from a tiny faculty. We're building out from there, small student cohorts. And so we didn't set up with a big research arm to test all this, much as I would like to do that. We've looked at this before, but now we're a bit more mature. We're looking at competency frameworks. I've been instigated by some governments, the Singaporean government had one, for example, and we might try to implement those in our tracking of students from when they join to when they leave. But it's a bit of a cost benefit thing. You've got to think, how much bureaucracy is this going to take? How much is this going to impact on the students themselves? They feel like guinea pigs, they're scrutinized all the time. And how much is it really going to give you something you need? And that's not always obvious, that trade-off.
Well, and also, I mean, you say they were the simple tools, but I think simple, but also the most baseline and of importance, I would say, in that student satisfaction and employability. I don't think the importance of those can be overlooked. I had a question on something that you've mentioned before, is that you increasingly teach on changing ideas of expertise. And particularly in this digital age where knowledge is, in theory and sometimes in practice, becoming more democratized and accessible. How do you see the concept of expertise evolving? How does this shift or impact the way we approach education and learning?
Yeah, so I answer that two parts, but I'll do the first part rather briefly because that's a particular theory of expertise called interactional expertise. And that's due to a very great sociologist of science in the UK called Harry Collins. And I teach on that, and I'm now doing some research into that and its relationship to leadership. But I think perhaps more interesting for you and your listeners is the whole discussion around AI. And I haven't come down on one side of this or the other yet, actually, but the dichotomy is becoming clearer to me. It's either we need even more generalists, more interdisciplinary people able to sort of ask the right question across all sorts of disciplinary boundaries and interrogate the answer they're getting from the machine. Or, and this would be very impactful on my life because I've been on the interdisciplinary side for ages, but it's possible that because the machine can give us so much information now, we need more and more hyper specialists to check that information and interrogate it. And I don't honestly know the answer yet. I teach a module here which lent very heavily into AI last year, even before it was hyper trendy or just at the beginning of the wave. Now it's it's almost past its very first phase, but people are still wondering what to do with it. And in this module, students have to co-write an essay with AI.
Wow.
And the essay itself is a vision paper. So it's deliberately very speculative, very creative. But then they have to also submit a video or audio recording of how they use the AI to create the vision paper. And both parts are assessed. And so in that explainer, I'm looking for that critical engagement and involvement with the AI. Any student just gives me the AI created essay, but basically gets a 0 because you just have to type into the thing and it'll create an essay. But a student who starts saying, I found this scientific paper, which I trusted because it came from this source and this other one that critiqued it. And then I combined it with this completely different idea of how to apply that science in a new space. I thought that was interesting. So then I had this discussion with chat and they show me this discussion thread. There, I think we're getting somewhere really interesting. All this discussion about unblocking, about ideation that the AI can do if you use it properly. And of course, sources, good AI like Perplexity, which I use all the time now, takes you directly to the source. So you have to teach students what is a good source, why is it a good source, why do you trust that source, did you find any other sources which countered that source, all those kind of meta things you can do. So that's where I am at with AI, using it in that kind of generative way for learning and assessing that. But as AI gets better, it's going to be really interesting to see whether young people can just learn the right questions to ask it and know which sources to trust and which not, or whether they're going to have to know in really minute detail whether a source is trustworthy, in which case we'll just need a whole bunch of really nerdy data scientists or really nerdy engineers to tell us what to trust and what not.
Yeah, that kind of that's a really interesting way of challenging students, because also that kind of media literacy, critical thinking is so necessary and really is not embedded across, and it should be across.
I'm amazed. I watch too much YouTube like everyone, and people like at the bottom, it was terrible how much that person spoke on the channel. I'm like, it's an edited video. That's what editing is. It's that way because the podcast wanted you to hear that person. These are not live podcasts. But that kind of basic media illiteracy is the norm, it seems to me. And how can we go forward as a society unless people's first response to media is skepticism? Like, where's this from? How is it edited? What does the people make of the video trying to say? All that stuff. Yeah, I totally agree. That is modern critical thinking, way more than arguing a logic of arguments, which is fine and important, but that comes second for me now.
Yeah, I'm with you. I wanted to ask you a question about something that you mentioned on a previous podcast you were on, the Ed Futurist podcast a few months ago. I heard a clip of you discussing academia's tendency to reproduce itself, and in particular, academics who hope to produce PhD students who then take their work into the next generation. There's been a lot of shifting power dynamics between students and educators in the latter half of the last century, I would say. Do you think these dynamics have changed the reproduction of what has gone before in academia, or what's your take? Because the kind of stopping the wheel of self-reproduction is something that I think a lot of people have been trying to halt, and maybe unsuccessfully.
That is a fantastic question, quite a rich question. Let me say first, there's a problem with size here, right? When you have 8% of the population go to university, there's nothing wrong with trying to reproduce the thoughts of your teachers. That's like a generational passing of the baton, kind of apprenticeship in intellectual work and so on. That's great. Now we have 40, 50%. That's clearly, I think, detrimental, both to thought in general, but also to the vast majority of students. So that's one thing to think about. Then I think the second thing to say is, and we see this at LIS actually, I think it's become quite polarized between the humanities and non-humanities, or sciences and engineering. We brand ourselves as radical. I think that might be a bit of a problem for us, but let's see going forward, because it means half our students are extremely woke, I would say, on the left, hyper left, have all the usual things that go with that. And about half our students, or slightly less, maybe 30 to 40%, are pretty anti-work in the kind of Elon Musk, Silicon Valley type way. It's tech solutions. And of course, there are a bunch of kids in the middle who are far too sensible for all that. But let's focus on that as a kind of picture. And I think both of those have problems with reproducing themselves, but it's quite healthy at LIS that they are actually in one arena, because they both turn up and go, oh, you thought that's what radical was? No, oh, I thought, and then I'm like, okay, you guys have got to get together in a group. And we do a lot of real world focused work. So you have to work on a consultancy report for an external organization, say on the ethics of their supply chain. Off you go. Don't care if you work or anti-work, sort this out, do the problem. And so sort of, I think that's very healthy from a kind of growth point of view and also getting real things done point of view. But it's interesting that we have both those camps thinking about how to use the knowledge that we're telling them. Now, neither of those camps, and this is a bit special to LS because we're really real world focused, neither of those camps are really looking to create something more in academia. LS doesn't really exist for that. There's too many PhDs out there. Heaven only knows there are just too many PhDs in the world. I mean, it's fine. You want to stay in university, do a PhD. It's harmless, but I honestly think all the stats will bear me out here that it's pretty useless. It drops your employability a bit, at least in the UK and the US. I'm not sure about elsewhere, and so on. So we don't have that problem at LIS. We will encourage students to take the learning we give them and have some real impact with that in the real world. But I think that even in more mainstream universities, there should be more help to help students connect what they're doing with what the vast majority of them will do later rather than do a PhD.
And that those kind of arenas where, two maybe semi-opposing groups can come together and work on something, and equally opposing and not taking divine inspiration from one lecturer, one point of view, but coming together with a diversity of opinion, I think is always great.
So we have two statements that guide our curriculum. One is, in order to tackle complex real-world problems, you have to pursue multiple perspectives, pursue them actively. And in order to tackle complex real-world problems, you need to think in terms of networks and relationships. So the pursuing perspectives thing, if you like, that's quite a value statement in itself. You can't escape value statements. We have ours here too. And you might see, if anything, that is slightly more towards the more leftist side of things than the rightist. But be that as it may, it still means that if you're on the left or if your work, you have to pursue a perspective which actively challenges your whole worldview and might be, as we sometimes says now, make you feel unsafe, all those things. That's part of the deal here. You have to pursue multiple perspectives, even no matter where you end up. The other one, actually, I just think that to have something on thinking in terms of networks and relationships for students is just great, because that's how actually the world works, how we get things done. And so some of our assignments require them to reach out and find someone in the real world who's interested in their project, to supervise it or to watch their presentation, something like that. It's a kind of non-academic, but very real about how they're going to make progress in the world.
Yeah. Wow. And I mean, far better than the typical slow burn of student projects that that everyone despairs over. I am conscious of time, Carl, but we did get one question that I wanted to ask you that is more so about the teaching process. One of the attendees asked, what are some recommended digital tools that maybe you use or that you recommend for academic education?
Interesting. Thank you. Gosh, this has flown by. Sorry, it's gone too quick. So we do flipped learning here. We don't have a very innovative learning platform. I'm not sure I should advertise it as one of the 3 main ones in this country. It's fine. But we put all our stuff up on advance at the time when we meet the students, the in-person synchronous time. So we do a lot of activities in the real time. The tool which I've used most productively was actually Butter, the Butter learning platform. We unfortunately have moved away from it because we've gone on Microsoft Teams and we're supposed to do everything in-house. So there's a bureaucratic/techno constraint. But I did like Butter. If your listeners don't know it, it's cutesy, but lots of nice affordances. There's a communal whiteboard. The breakout rooms are great. It's good. It's a good tool. It's like Zoom, like Teams, but way better, specifically designed for learning. So that's the specific tool I mentioned. I'd like us to do more things like VR. We've got a little bit of that going on in some pockets, but we haven't really dived into that.
Okay. Well, I've not heard of Butter Learning myself.
Okay.
I'll definitely check it out. Carl, I would love to continue asking you questions, specifically also more about your opera background, but maybe we'll have to save that for another day.
That would be lovely, Madeline. Yeah. Are you interested in opera?
I played classical flute, violin, and piano,
Wow.
so I do love a bit of opera. And it's
Wow.
rare that I get to talk about opera on the UIN podcast, but maybe today is the day. Carl, if people want to find out more about LIS or indeed find out more about you, how can they find you? Where can they find you?
So I have a personal page on LinkedIn and on X/Twitter and recently on Blue Sky as well. Open to people contacting me. I may not be able to get back because I do get tens of or hundreds of inquiries a week. The website is London Interdisciplinary School in the UK, London Interdisciplinary School. You can have a look there and contact us through that if you're interested as well.
Sounds good. All right. Don't get too excited and I'll go to Carl at once. He's a busy man. But that's great. Thanks so much for your time, Carl. And
thanks, Madeline.
I'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the discussion. Follow UIN on LinkedIn, and if you're enjoying our podcast, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review on your podcast platform of choice to help others find this content too.